escape, aggravated assault on law enforcement, car theft.
Go in to the front with a box or a cooler full of guns.
They are tracked down. There's a police barricade. There's a shootout. These guys now have a car with 3 good tires, and they're stuck in the desert. What do you do?
This should be a movie.
Been a little while.
Been a while.
I've had some, an opportunity to sit down. I guess it's probably good to recap, what we've done in the last little while. I myself was occupied in a really lengthy trial where I'd represented this client for a few years, and his case finally went to trial. It was a 3-week-long trial. It ended in a hung jury, of all things. And, sometimes people wonder what that is. A hung jury, as you know, is where, in this case, there had to be 12 jurors. Not all 12 could agree. In fact, the split, I think, was 10-2 in favor of guilt, unfortunately. But 2 jurors did not align with the other jurors.
Could not be swayed.
And they couldn't be swayed. That was really interesting. We had an opportunity to go back and talk to the jury. And they believed they were on our side, the defense, and wouldn't be moved. So that was one thing that I did. You just came from court.
Yeah.
As well. You got the tie on and everything, looking sharp.
Thank you.
Yeah. So just been busy.
Yeah. We've been kind of took turns being out of town, all kinds of stuff.
So we apologize to our faithful viewers.
I know would have been very upset.
Well,
that we found great.
I know that I have had several people reach out to me, Dave, when are we going to get another podcast?
I know.
And so here we are.
It made me feel good. I had that too. So
yeah.
Nice.
So here we are. We're still dedicated to the same things that we were doing before, which is break down and analyze Arizona cases, help our listeners understand the law a little bit, and really broaden everyone's understanding of how criminal cases develop and work in Arizona and in the U.S.
Yeah, specific to Arizona, specific to criminal defense, right? I mean, right now, at least, might branch out beyond Arizona at some point. But, there's so many interesting cases, and we've kind of, crunched down on several, and we've got a doozy today.
Yeah.
One that when we found out about it and kind of read through it, we both had the same thought, right? Which was, this should be a movie.
Exactly.
I can't believe this isn't a movie. So we look it up, sure enough, 2 movies.
Turns out it's a movie.
Turns out it's 2 movies.
Documentaries. Yeah, this one was one that, you had brought to my attention. I honestly had not heard of this before, but as you said, you start digging, you start learning about it, and you think, gosh, this is wild.
Yeah.
Wild set of facts. And that ultimately then goes up to the U.S. Supreme Court. We talked, I think our last case that we did, or one of them was Miranda. That was a U.S. Supreme Court case. And so this one also is a U.S. Supreme Court case. Of course, it takes a long time getting there, right? It takes a number of years, but we're going to start at the beginning, which is, and I'll kind of set it up and you can go further. But essentially you have a man, Gary Tison, who is the father, the patriarch of this clan of boys. He's got some sons. Gary is in prison for murder. He's in prison with another fellow named Randy Greenewald, who's also in prison for murder. They're down in Florence. We have talked about the Florence prison system in a previous podcast, but that's where really the largest of the Arizona prison complexes are. So Gary Tison, Randy Greenewald are there.
We go there all the time.
And I've been there many times.
Yeah.
As a visitor, of course.
Yes.
As a visitor. I go in the front door and I come out the front door.
But it feels like you're there forever.
Oh my gosh.
It's a weird time suck.
You go into a jail or prison facility and it does feel like, sort of your world is sort of collapsed in on it a little bit.
It is an interesting experience.
So in any event, this is in the late 70s, in 1978. Gary is in prison, Randy's in prison, and they hatch a plan. Plan is to get Gary and Randy out of prison.
Yeah.
And so the boys get involved. He's got some late teenage sons, 19, 20, 21-year-old boys. Their names are
Donnie,
Ricky, and Raymond.
Yeah.
Okay. And they're going to be important as we move through the facts. His wife supposedly was part of the planning. But on this day, July 30th, 1978, tell us what happened a little bit.
So you got Raymond, well, he goes by Ray, Ricky, and Donald. They apparently were able to visit their dad pretty regularly. They went, again, it's hard to picture this, right? We've seen the movie, so whether that was accurate or not, I don't know. I watched the movie. Basically go in to the front with a box or a cooler full of guns, like many guns, into the prison, and somehow get it past everybody and break dad out of prison, out of jail. And it's a big facility. And one of the things we were talking about, we were like, how does that happen, in today's world? And I was thinking, gosh, maybe because it's Florence, right? It's this little town. Maybe back in 1978, it was just this little facility, at least in the movie, which was made in 1983. So it wasn't like a long time after this. It's pretty much the same facility, but much smaller, but it's similar.
I think it's an important point, though, to clarify. When we say a prison system, you have to understand that each prison is comprised of individual yards. Okay, and a yard is a separate division of that prison. They're like almost these little communities. And so to get into a prison visit, you and me today in 2025, I have to make an appointment with an individual yard. And to get inside that yard, it's not very big. There is a building that you walk through. There's guards, you walk through security, you go through the x-rays and all of that. And then immediately behind that security building is the yard. And then within that yard are individual lockdown facilities. As I understood it, at least my belief is that Gary and Randy were just within that yard. And so all these boys had to do was to get past that initial guard station, which they did with the guns. And surprisingly, no shots were fired. Nobody was hurt. They were able to work things in a way where any visitors or guards were sort of locked in this separate room within that initial facility, and they got, Gary and Randy out.
They got out. And so they get out, and they've got this thing pretty well planned, right? So they have a vehicle, obviously. They get the guns and everything, put them away. They drive to another location, switch cars. So obviously they knew, guards had seen which car was driving away, apparently, or somebody had. They switched cars, a car that was waiting in a particular lot. They then took that car and drove it to a home that had been they had secured.
Kind of a stash house.
Yeah. So they hung out for a few days.
This home where they hang out for a couple of days to sort of, regroup, I suppose. Problem is the second car that they got had a flat tire.
Yeah. So as they're getting there, or at some point it gets a flat tire, they use the spare. So they're okay. They're on the spare. Next leg of the trip, they need to get on the way to Mexico. Well, it's weird because they actually head north.
Yeah, according to the opinion, the facts and the opinion are they head north towards Flagstaff.
Right.
What route they used to get there, I'm not exactly sure.
They talk about back roads.
Right. They had to drive through the desert. So, Florence to Flagstaff, there are a number of ways to get there. In any event, on this road, something bad happens, they get another flat tire.
Yeah.
They've already used up their spare, and so now they've got no other vehicle.
And they're stuck, right? This is a tough
they're in the
situation because
it's July.
Yeah, July in Arizona.
Probably August at this point. That is the heart. If you've ever been to Arizona in the summer, it's hot.
It's hot.
Hot. And so these guys now have a car with 3 good tires, and they're stuck in the desert. What do you do?
So what they decide to do is hide in the bushes, at least 4 of the 5 men. They have Ray, the youngest, get out into the road and flag down a passerby. The people that stop, it's a family. It's a dad and a wife, and they have a 15-month-old son, I believe, and also their niece, who's a teenager.
So this Mazda goes by, just to fill in the facts a little bit. Mazda is occupied by a fellow named John Lyons, his wife, Donelda. Their 2-year-old son, 15 to 2 years old, 15 months to 2 years old, Christopher, and then a 15-year-old niece named Teresa Tison, no relation to the other Tison. So Tison, this is Tyson. In any event, 4 people who are now flagged down by the Tisons.
Yeah, so as soon as they stop, guys jump out of the bushes, hold them up, basically have this plan that they're going to drive both cars kind of off the road, transfer the items that they have from their vehicle to the new vehicle that they're going to steal. And at that point, it starts to turn a little bit dark, and you can, not that this is the first part, but especially, and at some point, you have, the two convicted murderers, basically, right?
Gary Tison and what's his name? Randy Greenewald.
Yeah. And they are basically holding these people up, at gunpoint while everything's being done, having the boys transfer everything. And it's hard, right? It's hard for us to really know what happened as far as the details go, but it looks and it sounds from everything that we know that at some point, the Mr. Lyons basically starts to plead for his family's life.
Yeah, he says, look, give us some water.
We won't tell anybody.
We won't do anything. We're going to be, we'll just be here in the desert. You guys are good to go. Take our car. In fact, in that Mazda, there was, I think, some food and some guns as well.
No, right.
Not sure what that family was up to. Maybe they're just
out shooting in the desert.
Right.
Like we do.
With the baby and a 15. I don't know. In any event, there were useful things in their car, and they were willing to give their car up. They just wanted a little bit of water and to be let go.
In fact, Gary had shot out the radiator
of the Lincoln car, is what they were driving.
Right. And it's not like that car was going anywhere. And they were out in the middle of the desert.
Very risky position to be.
So at that point, Gary says to his sons, all right, or at least one, go get the water, and he's holding them up. Then the other sons, it's a little unclear on exactly.
Sons were nearby, and that's important.
Yeah.
Sons were nearby. They saw what was about to happen next. They didn't do anything to stop it. They didn't intervene. And then,
well, that's disputable, right? But whether they saw what was going to happen next, they said they were surprised at what happened next.
Right, and don't misunderstand my comments. I guess they didn't participate in what happened next, and they didn't expect it.
Right.
But they were nearby, and they observed it, and they didn't do anything either to stop it or to remedy it after the fact.
And so you can probably guess what happened. Right. Gary and Randy just shot the family to death.
That's right.
And we're talking. I mean, it's incredibly sad.
Husband,
young baby with a baby
and a 15-year-old
and just
teenager. All four of them.
Yeah. And so at that point, the group, the 5 men, get into the car and they drive away. And
they leave the family there in the desert. Turns out the teenager wasn't killed immediately. She survived a little bit, apparently, and tried to get away, but ultimately died there. Child murdered, husband and wife murdered. The Lincoln is left behind. They take off in the Mazda. Now, as I understood it, there's obviously this big manhunt to find Gary Tison and his accomplices, Greenewald as well. Eventually, they are tracked down. There's a police barricade. There's a shootout. Donnie Tison gets killed in the shootout.
That's one of the sons.
That's one of the sons. The other 2 boys, Ricky and Raymond, survive and they take him into custody.
You got
Gary wanders off into the desert.
Just take off.
They don't find Gary for a while later, and he's actually dead from exposure. He dies in the desert.
11 days later, just dead in the desert. No gunshots or anything, just died of exposure.
Right. He had no means to take care of himself on his own. No water, no food, no supplies. He dies in the desert.
Greenewald also taken into custody.
So you have these young boys who participated then in this breakout, and then later they didn't shoot, they didn't kill this family, but they certainly participated in events leading up to and following after this, quadruple murder.
Yeah, which really leads to some interesting legal issues, right? Which are kind of hard to separate out in our minds. So what I'd like us to do, and you can, take us in a different direction if you like, but what I'd like to do is first talk about what crime they were actually convicted of and what's the theory behind it, and then what happened as far as the sentencing part of it and the ultimate punishment, right? So the first one is they were charged with something called felony murder.
Right. And I guess to be clear, they committed a long stream of offenses. I mean, escape, aggravated assault on law enforcement. there's dozens of different crimes, car theft, whatever. I mean, you could go on for days. We're focusing on, and what the Supreme Court focused on was what you just touched on, which is felony murder. What is felony murder? Okay. So felony murder is this idea that if during the commission of certain offenses, let's say robbery or kidnapping or other violent crimes, a person is killed, even though that death may be unintentional, it can still be first-degree murder in Arizona and in most other jurisdictions.
And importantly, even if it's not that person that
That's right.
committed it.
And that's where we're going to start really analyzing this case for what it stands for. But the idea that you may not have pulled the trigger, but somebody died as a result of this, other conduct, the kidnapping, the robbery, the escape, whatever it was, that's felony murder. Okay. Now, most jurisdictions, as I said, accept and have this concept of felony murder. That really, in and of itself, is not all that, bizarre or landmark, right? Or unique, I guess is the right word. What's interesting, and this is the focus of our discussion, is when is it appropriate for the court to impose the death penalty on somebody who is not the trigger man, perhaps didn't even have intent to kill, but who is found to be culpable for felony murder?
Right. So let's talk through that a little bit, right? So the felony murder part of it is not just any felony, right? Some people think if you're committing any felony and somebody dies. Right. So there's specific ones that are outlined, and they're different state to state. Obviously, armed robbery, things like that they were convicted of, in this case, qualified. The trial for the two boys, they were convicted of the felony murder, and they were sentenced to death. Greenewalt was tried separately, I believe, and he also was found guilty and sentenced to death.
Now, Greenewalt's situation, though, just to separate him out right in the beginning, it's different. Greenewalt pulled the trigger.
Yes.
He's the gunman. We're not talking about felony murder for Greenewalt. We're talking about intentional first-degree murder where he premeditatedly killed other people. Mm-hmm. Done. Easy question.
Yeah,
right?
Real easy. But
and just to finish his story, I'm sorry, he ultimately was tried and later executed.
Yeah.
So his case, in terms of the legal discussion, is quite simple, along those lines. What's more interesting are the situation involving the two boys, Ricky and Raymond.
Right. So really, really interesting. Okay. So first of all, to even find the criminal culpability or guilt, how you find them guilty, it's kind of an extended, really old doctrine, that's being used here of felony murder to say, look, if you engage in these certain felony behaviors, you are creating kind of this danger, and if somebody gets killed, you're going to be liable. I mean, I've seen it where it's even the co-defendant, right? Somebody who you're committing the offense with, and they get killed during that process, you can get charged with felony murder of that person, if they're shot by police.
That's right. That's right. Now, felony murder in terms of punishment, we have to frame this in the right way. So how can the court, or what is it that the court is analyzing to say whether the death penalty for felony murder is appropriate or not appropriate? This becomes an Eighth Amendment discussion. Okay, Eighth Amendment from sixth grade civics or from the Constitution, right, is whether that type of punishment is cruel or unusual or appropriate given the level of conduct. And so what's interesting in this type of case, or in this case specifically, is that in felony murder situations, you may have a spectrum of two things. One, the person's intent. Did they have intent to kill? And intent to kill may be, again, a spectrum. It depends on the facts. The other part of it is, what's their degree of participation in the offense? And so that is what the U.S. Supreme Court, in fact, Sandra Day O'Connor is the author of the opinion in the Tison matter in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. Those are the two main things that she and the court analyze in deciding, does Ricky and Raymond Tison's actions, are they worthy of the death sentence?
Yeah, and I think that's interesting, right? Because whenever you get into this discussion, it gets a little bit hard for people to wrap their heads around, sort of, because you say, look, people got killed, a family got killed, a tragedy, right? And these guys got convicted of murder for it, even though they didn't, pull the trigger. Sometimes there's not a lot of sympathy to be like, well, it's, and I don't want to say unequal. It's not the right level of penalty for what they did. Is the death penalty? That's the question, right? And the Eighth Amendment talks a lot about it. Even when you're not talking about it being cruel and unusual, you're saying, does it match?
Proportional, I think is the word.
Proportional, that's it. Where you say to what they actually did. And like you said, nobody's saying they didn't do bad things or commit crimes. It's just that, the dissent in this case talked a lot about, how do you say that somebody who didn't intend to commit a crime and didn't actually commit the crime gets the ultimate penalty of death, right?
Right. And so it's important, I think, to use the same framework in our discussion that the Supreme Court used. Arizona, for a long time, has had this sentencing structure for capital cases, which is the state has to prove, and we've talked about these in other cases and other podcasts, the state has to prove certain statutory aggravating factors. And then the defense can show the court, to a lesser degree, mitigating factors. And what the court has to do is balance the aggravating factors against the mitigating factors to determine, is the death sentence appropriate? Okay. Under that framework, there was a case that came after the Tison brothers case. It went to the U.S. Supreme Court before Tison. And Arizona had to analyze the Tison case under this new Endman versus Florida case. Without getting into too much sort of legal mud here, I'll shorten it. The Endman versus Florida case was interesting. It was an armed robbery and murder of a couple in their home in Florida. Endman was the getaway driver. His car was parked away from the scene. He remained in his car. His accomplice went inside, robbed and murdered an elderly couple, and then they fled the scene. All Endman did was drive the car to the scene. He didn't get out. He didn't shoot. He didn't do anything.
They even say, I think, that he didn't plan it. I don't know.
He was the getaway driver, was not involved at all in the physical homicide or the burglary robbery. And so the Supreme Court had to analyze, well, under that type of scenario where Endman didn't have the intent to kill and his degree of participation was minimal, should Endman get the death sentence? Okay. Under Endman, then there's this framework of degree of participation versus intent to kill. And so then the Tison case gets analyzed by the Arizona Supreme Court under that Endman framework. And Arizona says, yep, the death sentence is still appropriate for these guys. Why? Because their degree of participation is high, and although they didn't have intent to kill, their intent was still sufficiently high to warrant a death sentence. So that's the framework that Sandra Day O'Connor, as well as the remaining majority portion of the court, analyzed their case. Okay. And ultimately, without spoiling the ending, I'll just say the court held that Ricky and Raymond's participation was substantial, right? I mean, think about that.
And that was interesting. They made a factual finding, the U.S. Supreme Court, on that, which, again, the dissent had a hard time with.
Well, I thought that the majority's analysis of their degree of participation actually was really convincingly written. If I could just read a portion of it. I loved how the court wrote this. They said, Raymond Tison brought an arsenal of lethal weapons into the Arizona State Prison, which he then handed over to two convicted murderers, one of whom he knew had killed a prison guard in the course of a previous escape attempt. By his own admission, he was prepared to kill in furtherance of the prison break. He performed the crucial role of flagging down a passing car occupied by an innocent family, whose fate was then entrusted to the known killers he had previously armed. And that's powerful. He robbed these people at their direction, and then guarded the victims at gunpoint while they considered what next to do. He stood by and watched the killing, making no effort to assist the victims before, during, or after the shooting. Instead, he chose to assist the killers in their continuing criminal endeavors, ending in a gun battle with the police in the final showdown. I mean, if that's not substantial participation, That's really persuasive writing.
Sure. And it's another thing too, where when you're just reading through it and the facts and and they're talking about, because it's a little confusing on how the Arizona Supreme Court actually analyzed it, because they didn't actually use the same framework that we just talked about as the U.S. Supreme Court.
No, this is the Supreme Court looking back.
Right. The Arizona Supreme Court said, because they looked at Enman, right? I don't want to get too deep in the weeds.
Right.
Enman just said, look, they actually didn't have the degree of participation part of it, I don't think. It was just about them analyzing that this is a guy who had no intent for this to occur, right? For a murder to occur. And in that case where there's no intent and he didn't commit anything that, he isn't the trigger man or didn't actually commit the crime, then shouldn't be held to or eligible for the death penalty. And that's why the U.S. or the Arizona Supreme Court took that and said, well, we think they had intent, because let me tell you about all the things that they knew and the things that they did. It's confusing. But then the U.S. Supreme Court looks at it and says, it's actually the wrong way to look at it, Arizona Supreme Court. It's really about, and then we just talk about those things, it's really about degree of participation and intent.
Intent to kill.
Right. Well, no, degree and...
Well, the U.S. Supreme Court says...
Degree of participation and... What was the other piece?
So ultimately, the U.S. Supreme Court finds that the Tison brothers had what they called a reckless indifference to human.
Reckless indifference,
okay, which is different than a specific intent to kill. But the idea is the same. You're engaged in such lethal, potentially lethal conduct, as I just read, that no matter what you do, the value that you place, or by engaging in that conduct, you're showing that the value that you place on human life is very minimal. Meaning, this family that stopped in the Mazda, even though you didn't pull the trigger, you were essentially indifferent to their fate because you were engaged with these people who you knew had a high degree of likelihood that they were going to harm them.
Yeah, and it is an easy argument to say, yeah, I can buy into that, And I thought I was quite convincing too, to get through it and say, yeah, it makes sense, right? You're going to hand two convicted killers a bunch of guns in a situation where it's quite likely they're going to need to use them, right? In order to get away. And then that happens, and you can't be like, I didn't think that was going to happen, right? But I think what a couple points to, that the dissent made. So how it works is you have the U.S. Supreme Court, there's 9 members. Generally, sometimes they don't all rule on every case, but you've got 5-4 in this case. It was close, right? So 5 said, yes, we're going to uphold the death penalty in a way. Actually didn't say that. They sent it back to the Arizona Supreme Court to say, do it under this analysis that we just invented, and see if they still qualify for the death penalty. But they kind of gave them a hint to say, we think their participation was substantial. And so the dissent made a couple of, I thought, convincing points, right? Number one is to say, and this maybe just came from my reading of it, is to say, that's why they're guilty of murder in the first place, right? It's because their behavior was so, Arizona used a foreseeable kind of standard to say, if you're going to do this type of behavior, even though you didn't kill anybody, even though you didn't intend to kill anybody, you're going to you're eligible to be found guilty of murder, okay? That's different than saying you're now eligible for the ultimate punishment of the death penalty. And that's where I think we really struggle in this situation, is to separate out those two things, is to say, we already really raised your culpability or your ability to be found guilty of a more serious crime just because you were involved and you did those things, right? What Enman really stood for, as far as what a lot of people believed, was that if you did not commit the crime yourself and you didn't intend for it, how are you going to be found guilty of, or not found guilty, but sentenced to death when it wasn't even your intent for that to handle, and didn't do it?
Well, and that's like what we were saying in the beginning. That's why this is an Eighth Amendment case, because we're talking about degrees of
sort of punishment, right?
Punishment of, allotment of that punishment. It's not a question of, are you guilty? I think universally we can agree the Tisons are guilty of murder. The Enman was guilty of murder as an accomplice, right? You're not the primary, you're not the principal, you're not the lead actor, but
And that's a pretty serious sanction on you,
of course,
for just participating.
and in Arizona, that sanction is either life or natural life in prison. Okay. What these cases stand for then is that next proposition. Standing in that position as somebody who isn't the trigger man, but to some degree participated in the commission of very serious offenses, can you then have that same degree of punishment as the guy who pulled the trigger? Now, this is a good comparison because we know that Greenewalt, who was the trigger man, he was sentenced to death and he was executed. Whereas the Tison boys, what do you do with them? You know, do you lock them up for good or do you not? Okay. Yeah, and so that the Supreme Court, they're using this framework, just to be clear about what the Supreme Court did, is they said...
U.S. Supreme Court.
U.S. Supreme Court. Their degree of participation was substantial. They manifested an extreme indifference to the value of human life. Therefore, under Enmond and its rulings, they are eligible for the death penalty. Now, to your point a few minutes ago, just to be clear, you're right. The Arizona Supreme Court, in previously reaching the same conclusion, according to the U.S. Supreme Court, had applied Enmond in the wrong way, which is why then the U.S. Supreme Court sends it back to the Arizona trial court and says, hey, do it again, but do it under this framework that we've now reestablished, which is degree of participation and extent to which they had intent to kill.
Right. And it's interesting, too, because that's the other thing that the dissent really goes after them for. They just made this up, right? This degree of participation and reckless indifference to human life. This is the first time it appears this way.
Well,
and says, now this is how we do this.
I'm going to defend Justice O'Connor here for just a minute.
She, our law school is named after her.
I'm a graduate of the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law. In fact, I was a student there when they named it. There was a ceremony. The governor came. Justice O'Connor was on video.
She still comes. I don't know if she's what. I mean, when I was in law school just a few years later, she would come at the end of the year when all the graduates were there. It was pretty cool. Anyways,
this was. So I'm going to defend her.
I understand, which I disagree with.
Right. I understand the dissent. Has their point that this is pulling a thin air. Not true. Okay. What the majority did was survey the death penalty law across the 50 states, and they said certain states do it this way, other states do it this way, other states do it this way. Why did they do that? Because the Eighth Amendment is a value judgment. It is what is cruel and unusual, or what is disproportionate. You have to look at us as a society and say, what do we believe in as human beings, as Americans, as citizens of this state or that state?
And that's a common way for them to do an analysis, right? They'll do an analysis of all the states to say, generally as a people, what are we accepting?
Right. And so she does that. And then she says, at the end of the day, the things that must be analyzed are their degree of participation. And we're not going to dispute that. I mean, that is a critical factor in determining someone's culpability, is to what did they, how far did they get into this thing? Were they Enmond sitting on the side of the road waiting for everybody to come out of the house? Or were they like the Tison boys, essentially feeding all of the things that these murderers needed to get their job done? And I'll stand with her and say, look, those guys clearly had a much higher degree of culpability
and participation. And I'll stand with the dissent. And here's what the dissent said, right? They said, well, that was a tricky way to do a survey, right? Okay. All they did was survey the states who do allow death penalty in,
which is a majority of states by far.
I don't think it was. I don't think it was.
Absolutely.
Let's look through the dissent.
Oh boy, you're gonna.
Yeah, let's see. Regardless, right? They're saying you didn't look at all of the states and say, hey, some states don't even allow that. All you're doing is taking a sampling.
32 American jurisdictions permitted the
a little bit over half.
Right. That is a majority.
Okay. A little over.
When a presidential election is decided by 51, 49.
Irrelevant.
That is a clear majority.
Okay. But if you're going to eliminate the other, let's say 33% or 40% of the states and say, we're not going to take into account how they look at it, we're only going to look at the states.
But wouldn't you agree that has to be apples to apples then? I mean, if you're going to say, how are we going to impose the death penalty? You cannot consider those that don't. You have to say, look, they've decided that they don't, and that's fine. Of those that do, We have to see how they do it.
No, because this is the U.S. Supreme Court doing a nationwide survey. That's the whole point.
We live in a federalist system, and states have the ability to say, we have the death penalty or we don't.
Well, that's the battle anyway.
My argument. Yeah. My argument is that you can't take into account those that don't do the death penalty because they're irrelevant to the discussion.
Only to the point that you're saying I'm expressing the attitudes and the feelings of the American people.
Okay, I get that, but this isn't a survey on whether the death penalty is appropriate or not. It is a mechanical discussion on how should it be applied in the states that use
and that's
it.
Not an interesting point, but also the dissent actually goes there too.
Okay.
Right? And the dissent says just kind of what you said, right? The Eighth Amendment is a value judgment. And in this type of case, where we got little over half, a majority of the state saying we think this and the other half don't, how do you say, yes, it's fair for us to give the death penalty to this person? Because it makes it so that the death penalty is too arbitrary. That was their argument as far as this goes.
I stand by my argument. You stand by yours. And that's what makes this interesting, right? People can decide what do they believe in. And I think every American honestly should think about.
They really should. About the death penalty in general, but this is a real specific piece too.
But I think in general, it is important for you to make a decision on your own. Is this something that I support or do I not support it?
And do some research on it.
And do some research, educate yourself, okay? And then as this legal framework goes, though, I understand why Justice O'Connor and the majority went this way, because they're looking at those states that do impose it. And as a practical matter, they have to give guidance to those states. They can't just say, well, 18 states don't do the death penalty, and so that makes our discussion irrelevant. You can't do that. You've got to give guidance to the 32 that do and say, if you're going to impose the death penalty, it's got to be done in a certain way. And in these sort of narrow margin of cases, these felony murder cases where the death penalty is imposed, well, then here's a framework.
Sure.
I think you have to do that.
Sure. Okay, so next what happens, they send it back to the trial court. Trial court, again, affirms and says, yes, it qualifies under this, and they impose the death penalty, again, on the boys.
Except that later, through subsequent review, their sentences are reversed or modified to life in prison sentence.
Yeah, the death penalty sentence is overturned. And it's interesting, they're done separately for different reasons. One maybe 8 years apart. It's, one of them had to wait longer than the other, and for different reasons. And so that was an interesting part of it. So both of these men are now older men, not on death row. They're in prison, I believe, back in Florence. I don't know. I'd have to check on where.
I don't know specifically where they're located.
I looked them up, and I don't remember.
What I do know is they were young men. They were 19, 20 years old when this happened. And they're going to spend the rest of their days in prison.
One of them actually has 25 to life.
But do you think the governors can commute that sentence? I don't think any governor commutes that sentence. Not very good optics.
Yeah.
Anyways, that's the Tison case. Really interesting set of facts. I don't think we haven't really had a debate where we really disagreed. Yeah. So, but I won clearly.
Go ahead and vote.
I'm going to vote. I'm kidding. No, I think these discussions are healthy. I think they're good. And again, I think if all we do today is to get our listeners to think about these things and consider them and develop their own articulated opinions, then we've done our jobs.
Yeah. And, I think in this particular topic itself, you need to be careful where, again, the dissent talks about we want retribution, right? And in this case, I think it's kind of unique because everybody hated Gary Tison. He was the baddest guy.
He did, right?
Yeah. And so we don't get to punish this guy.
Right.
So all we have is his sons. And there was kind of an outcry, right? And that shouldn't be the basis.
Right. I mean, the guy that you wanted to sort of hold at the center of this, you don't get to.
Right. And their fear is that that becomes part of them.
That's a really important point. Thank you for bringing that up. You got it. All right. Wrap it up.
All right, it worked. Appreciate it.